This video is in part made as a reply to a particular question from a particular longtime viewer and supporter of the channel. And it's in part a response to the genre of booktube videos, authortube videos, writertube videos here on YouTube, which is a really strange demimonde you guys may have no familiarity with. This may be the first time you've even heard about this phenomenon, or some of you may have already listened to innumerable hours of this kind of content. What struck me immediately in turning my attention to the author tube, writer tube subgenre is that I'm seeing again some of the same evils that were familiar to me from the world of vegan diet advice, vegan weight loss, fitness advice, that kind of thing. And also, strange and exotic as it may seem, the videos encouraging you saying that you can learn a new language in just 6 months. Maybe you can learn a new language in just 6 weeks if only you follow these few special pieces of advice. If only you will buy my ebook and use my special tools. If only you'll hear through my special reasoning. If only you'll follow my guidance. There's this sort of unbelievable emphasis on method, on craft. Right? Now, these are three completely different fields, different provinces, different types of human endeavor, right? Okay, so you think about diet, fitness, weight loss. It's one type of endeavor. How much does craft matter? How much does technique matter? How much does methodology matter in that field, right? And in what way? In what way does it matter, right? Like, even if you think about something like doing a push-up. I did 150 push-ups today. Not quite 200. My usual, but I did 150 push-ups a day. If I had done the technique slightly differently, right? There are so many YouTube channels selling you on this. If you'll do the push-up in exactly the way I do it, then the size of your chest muscles will expand more or something. A slight difference in technique. How much of a difference is that going to make compared to, for example, the difference between doing 100 push-ups and doing 200 push-ups? Like, if you have one guy who does 100 push-ups with perfect technique, and another guy does 200 push-ups but with sloppier technique, who's going to win this race? I'm not just asking the question, does method matter at all? How much does it matter? In what way does it matter, right? And you're turning to something like learning a language, right? All these people are trying to commodify methodology. They're trying to commodify a trick, a tip, a technique, a 12-step guide, these 7 simple steps. Sometimes all they want you to do is watch the YouTube video and like, share, and subscribe. Sometimes that's as far as the hook goes. But very often there's a further step of monetizing, this kind of advice. Now, today we're not talking about either of these. We're talking about, so shout out to William McGeehan. Yeah, 200 push-ups a day is my normal thing. So today was 150. It was my second workout. I did a first workout at the gym, and then the second time I went, did 150 push-ups. Just so you're all up to date. Okay, if you're talking about writing, are we talking about craft? Are we talking about method? Are we talking about technique? And to what extent are we talking about much more uncomfortable subjects like the life of the mind? And to what extent are we talking about who you are in terms of the story you have to tell and why you would be the person to tell it and not somebody else? Lots of guys have been to Cambodia. Like, literally millions of people go on vacation to Cambodia every year. I don't know the numbers. We could look it up. Cambodian Tourist Bureau. Okay. Why would you be the guy to write this book about Cambodia, right? If your answer is method, if your answer is technique, that's not a very good answer, is it? See? This is the kind of topic I love to record videos about. It's shallow and it's deep at the same damn time. I once saw an interview with a professional boxer. This was after his retirement. There was also an interview with some of his coaches, some of the guys who worked with him during his glory days. I do not remember this guy's name, and it's probably for the best I don't, because I'm probably getting some of the details wrong here. And some of you who are fans of boxing will know right away who I'm talking about from this anecdote. But the story, there may be different levels of fabrication and mystification and myth-making here, but the story, as I was told, was that this guy, he was a very large, very strong African-American who had been working in organized crime his whole life. And he had just recently moved up to being a professional assassin, being a professional hitman, to doing paid contracts to kill people for a living. What he did before that, I can't imagine. But anyway, this was a kind of promotion for him. He had never been trained in boxing. He had never been trained in any sport. He didn't have a prior background in football or something else like this. And he went into one of these gyms one day where there were really serious coaches, really serious trainers who'd worked with Olympic athletes. And he gets into the ring and he starts throwing punches. And they're amazed. And they say right away, it's his first day in the gym. He has no training. He has no experience. The main thing people said about this guy, and I remember they had a quote from Muhammad Ali about him, was just, he punches hard. Apparently he really threw his whole body weight into every punch. He just punched with all the strength he had in him. He had no training and no coaching. And on his first day in the gym, the coaches and trainers were saying, look, we can sign you up. We can make you a professional boxer and you're going to be in the top 10. You're going to be one of the greatest boxers. You may not be number one, but you are going to be a contender in the top title fights. They could tell right then, right? This guy hadn't even done the jogging. He hadn't done the jump rope. He hadn't done the speed bag. He'd done nothing. Okay. What had he done? He'd gotten used to punching people so hard, right? Punching people to save his own life in situations of self-defense, and punching people like he wanted to kill them. The difference between a great boxer and an amateur boxer, is it method? Is it training? Is it technique? Is it? Most times say, oh yeah. And you have to start training when you're 12 years old, and between 12 and 16, you have to build up these skills. Really? What about physical size? What about physical strength? What about brutality? What about some of those attitudes that maybe we don't want to think about, go into really punching someone with all the strength in your body, holding nothing back, you're really hurling yourself at someone with this kind of ferocity, right? What if that's not a technique? Now, again, I'm not saying training and technique have nothing to do with success in boxing. I'm challenging you to think, how important is this? And in what way is it important, right? Now, those aspects, methodology, that's what we can monetize, especially now in the 21st century. Oh, any of you guys in the audience, if you haven't already had this idea, start your own YouTube channel. Here are the 10 techniques that will make you a champion boxer. Here are the 10, speed bag methods, and here are the heavy bag methods, and here's how you should do push-ups. Here's exactly the angle at which you want to do push-ups. You can get really fussy with really particular techniques that will give people some kind of tiny edge or advantage, right? And no one's going to say, hey, if you want to be really great at boxing, guess what? Maybe you're born with it or you're not, right? Like just in terms of the dimensions of your body, right? No one wants to say, hey, you know what it really takes to be a boxer? Getting out there and actually literally being a killer, actually knowing what it's like to fight for your life. Maybe that's what helps. Maybe that's the technique that helps the most. Nobody wants to think that through. There are some of you in the audience who think this is a really abstruse allegory for what I'm saying about writing, how to be a great writer or a great novelist, whether it's fiction or not. Some of you think, wow, it's really a big stretch of the imagination to see how this applies to the craft and technique of writing. And some of you know exactly what the fuck I'm talking about without me having to draw the dotted lines, right? Who's going to write this book about Cambodia? Is it going to be the guy with the best technique, or is it going to be the guy who was a real killer? Literally or figuratively, you figured out who has the story to tell, and then who's going to be able to tell it, right? But you see, we can't monetize that, right? So in terms of hashtag booktube, hashtag authortube, hashtag writertube, in terms of what's being monetized here on YouTube, whether it's vegan diet and weight loss, whether it's under these different headings, right? It's methodology, it's technique. That's what we can mystify, and that's what we can commodify. And that's what we can claim is the difference between a successful writer and an unsuccessful writer. This cup, this merch, this is the difference between. Yeah. There were a lot of tie-ins that are frankly about that vulgar. Some time ago, this is off topic, but it's right on topic. I looked up the man who was quite literally the first bodybuilder in the history of Europe. And it's an interesting story in many ways. He was a Jewish immigrant or a Jewish refugee, and his Judaism is much, much concealed, as you can imagine, due to anti-Semitism in Europe at that time. And when he first started doing these exercises, first started doing these demonstrations and public shows, what people said, understandably, was nobody had seen physique like this. Nobody had seen muscles like this really popping off of the human body since the statues of ancient Greece and Rome. Now, if you don't know this, in a time before photography even, there were plastic replicas of all the greatest statues from ancient Athens and Rome that were distributed throughout Europe. So you might think only a small number of people could actually travel to Athens. This is true. A small number could travel from. But the most famous statues, especially those that were men rippling with muscles, they look like bodybuilders, those ancient Greek statues. Those were seen in all the cities of Europe. I mean, Berlin, Paris, even some small university towns. One of the reasons being that, artists would want to sit and copy them. They'd want to learn from the example how to draw, how to paint, how to sculpt, so on and so forth. So anyway, it was quite commonly seen. But of course, everyone wondered. There were athletes, there were military men, but there were no men with these tremendous muscles, popping off their body. This guy, the first bodybuilder in the history of Europe, he was also the first hit author to write a book telling you how you could have six-pack abs. He wasn't just a bodybuilder. He wasn't just a showman, because there had been strong men before him where they performed on stage lifting heavy objects. He did that also, right? But for him, the main step forward he took was not lifting heavy things on stage, which he did. It was just posing and flexing, wearing a loincloth, right? And he also sold photographs of himself. But the posing and flexing on stage, that was new. And then he sold you a book. And the book explained the technique whereby you could develop your musculature also. And then he sold you equipment. He sold you devices with springs so you could help build up your strength. Just mentioned the guy was completely, utterly non-vegan, and he died of a heart attack at quite an early age. So despite his amazing physique, he had a very high meat diet, and he collapsed and died. And was still young and in the beauty and vigor of his youth. As I recall, he stopped by the side of the road to push a cart out of a ditch, and he was famed for his feats of strength. He could lift a horse on stage and things like that. The cart wasn't that heavy, but he got out to help someone with some kind of cart or carriage that had gone off the side of the road. And you can imagine he wasn't warmed up. It's the perfect time to have a heart attack. Got out and rolled up his sleeves to push this cart out of a ditch. Had a heart attack, collapsed and died. At this point, this was literally the first bodybuilder. But already, this pattern that I'm criticizing in the video of taking the leap from my personal accomplishment, my personal beauty, etc., to monetizing that through a book selling you advice and then equipment and so on, right, was already ongoing. It didn't take a whole lot of time to develop over decades or centuries. Okay, so I have a message. I have a question from a member of the audience. Melissa's here, just off camera. She can interrupt my flow at any time. She can overturn the flow of conversation. And guys, I am seeing your comments as they come in. If you have something tremendously intelligent to say, you can also overturn the flow of my monologue at any time. So, longtime viewer and supporter of the channel who just uses the nickname Cedar writes in, quote, "This is kind of related to learning Pali, but it's more of a general question about the life of the mind. So if you don't know, Pali is an ancient language. It is now a dead language, but it is closely related to the living languages of India. So it is not so different from Marathi in modern India. But it's an ancient dead language, but has some application in modern languages of India today. Continue the quotation. How do you balance your intellectual interests? For context, my main ambition in life has always been to become a writer, fiction and nonfiction. I also know there's no use being a writer if you have nothing to write about. I don't want to be someone who works for years honing my craft only to write shallow and empty books. So I'm trying to figure out how to juggle. Sorry, you see the way in which I foreshadowed the questions and issues that are implicit in this email. Doesn't want to spend years of his life honing his craft only to write shallow and empty books. Quote, so I'm now trying to figure out how to juggle the advancement of my craft with the dispelling of my ignorance. And within that, there are many individual research projects I could take up. How do you approach having broad interests? When do you just read a few articles? When do you read a few books? And when do you decide to devote years of your life to something, as you did with the study of Buddhism? So again, Melissa may have something to say about this. Melissa, this has been sprung on her as a complete surprise. You guys in the audience may or may not have something interesting to say about this. But I'm going to start by responding to the very first part of that message. All right. He says it's a question about being a writer. It's a question about the life of the mind. And then he says, how do you balance your intellectual interests? When I was still in high school, I had the breakthrough, I had the realization, there is no such thing as balance. All right. Balance doesn't exist. All right. Balance is always a scam. It's always a form of self-deception or of someone else deceiving you. Right. There is no balance. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples here so you know where I'm coming from. Especially among the British, you always find British men who don't really want to commit to the woman in their life. Their girlfriend, frankly, could even be their wife. There's a man and he's with a woman. He says, well, you know, I only spend so many hours with her, and then I spend a certain number of hours hanging out with the guys or watching football or going to football games. And when you get to know him well, when he trusts you enough, it may be that what he means by hanging out with the guys is actually going to bars and nightclubs where he's attempting to pursue other women, or it may be that he's actually pursuing and sleeping with other women, even if it's occasionally, a couple times a year. British culture, very different from American culture this way. French culture, same thing, but frankly on another level. I think, honestly, if you got to know the different countries of Europe, you could now insert an analysis about Italian culture, Ukrainian and Russian culture. What do you mean by balance? I can tell you, with the British, what it always comes down to is that these men don't want to feel that they're losing something of themselves. They feel that their own status is elevated by having a kind of disdain and scorn for the woman in their life, rather than really loving her 100%, rather than really devoting themselves to that relationship. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here saying monogamy is a prerequisite for all good things in life. If you just search for the word monogamy on my channel, you can hear me philosophizing about this from 6 different directions. I'm not saying that at all. But my point is, if you don't look at this in terms of balance, if you instead look at the relationship and say, look, bro, what if you give this relationship 110%? What if you give it everything you've got? You give it everything you've got to give. And if that's not enough or it doesn't work out, then you can say to her, look, I did all I could. I gave everything I had to give and more. So now if this isn't working out, we got to break up. We got to move on because I've got nothing else to give. You can put yourself in that position. As opposed to, frankly, you half-ass it, as we say in plain English. You go kind of 50% and then you try to stay cool and aloof and keep your options open. As we say in plain English, you try to fuck around and then there you are weeping when the relationship falls apart. And the relationship may fall apart because she meets another guy who's more handsome than you, or it may fall apart for all kinds of different reasons. It may fall apart, and neither one of you knows why it fell apart. I have a friend who's going through divorce right now. I feel I know exactly why that couple fell apart, but that's another story. But have you thought about giving this absolutely 110%? The most intensity, the most commitment. And what would that be? Just to even visualize it, right? Now, notice the whole way I've structured this discourse. I'm not promising you'll succeed. On the contrary, right up front, I'm talking about the possibility or the probability of failure. You can give this relationship, give this woman 110% of everything you have to give, and it ends in failure. But when you walk away with the knowledge, I gave this 110%, right? Okay, so any of these interests for any period of my life, do you think I had a balanced approach to the study of Buddhist philosophy? No, I gave it 110%, my dude. So when people say to me, if anyone were to say to me, oh, you could have gotten a PhD in Buddhist philosophy, I can say, no. No. And I went to England and I met Professor Gombrich and I became friends with Madame Filiozat. I knew all the leading figures in the field and everyone was so impressed with me in my research. All kinds of people told me I was a genius and I was the future of Buddhist scholarship. And I published all these provocative articles. I did all this research. When I lived, oh, no, my dude. I gave it 110%. I knocked myself out. I know what's possible and what's impossible. I know what I've got to give, and I know when I've reached my limit of what I've got to give, right? Like that's subjective, what's possible in that sense. And then I know objectively what's possible in the rest of the world. I know, okay, just briefly about Buddhist scholarship. I know what's possible in Sri Lanka, and I know what's impossible in Sri Lanka. I know what's possible in Thailand. I know what's impossible. I know what's possible in Cambridge, England, Oxford, Poland. You know what I mean? All around the world, not just Canada, the United States or something. I got to know what was possible and impossible. I gave it 110%. And then when it is done, homie. And I don't look back on that as like 10 years of my life in which I was half-assing it or in which I had, some other interest or something. Or, you have to have balance. Like, what do you mean? Balance between playing World of Warcraft, playing some fucking video game for 6 hours at a time and reading books for 3 hours at a time. No balance. No balance between social life and research. No balance between video games. No balance. I didn't watch sports during those years. No. I was really committed to doing that 110%. Now, I can go through a whole bunch of other examples in my life, and you can say the same thing. When I worked on Cree and Ojibwe as languages, First Nations languages, American Indian languages, 110%. I was once actually really upset with my ex-wife now. She was my wife at the time. She was trying to get me to do a research project on Buddhism. I remember the room we were in and everything so vividly. I was saying to her, like, don't you understand? Like, that is over for me. I'm not a scholar of Buddhism anymore. And don't you see me knocking myself out? Like, I'm going to the library every day. I'm putting in the hours to work on Korean and Ojibwe. I'm starting a totally new career, which also entails its own political obligations, its own kind of ethical and moral quiddities, shall we say. I'm really committed to Cree, Ojibwe, First Nations politics. This is what I'm doing now. And from my perspective, this is what I'm doing with the rest of my life. Like, I can't believe you're trying to rope me into this research project on Buddhism in Asia. I forget, Buddhism in China, Buddhism in Taiwan. It was something like that, It's like, you don't understand me at all. She didn't understand me at all. No balance. I'm not trying to do both. No, that's it. It's absolute, total, give it 110%. And look, if you think that ends in tragedy, because already we only got 2 examples on the table. If you think, oh, well, at the end of that process, you're in this tragic, ruined condition of saying, I worked so hard. I gave it everything I had to give. I poured my heart into, I poured my mind, I poured my efforts into this language, this area of study, and also these linked political aspirations, humanitarian aspirations, altruistic aspirations, like aspirations to make the world a better place. Okay, you gave this 110%. You poured everything you had to pour into this, right? Isn't it sad? Isn't it tragic now that you have to quit and that you give up and go on? What's sad, what's tragic is when you half-ass it, right? When you give it 50% instead of 110%, when you don't really commit, when you don't really push your own limits, right? You don't find out what's possible and impossible for you subjectively and in the world objectively, whether that involves universities or humanitarian projects, whatever it is, whatever the outside contingencies and requirements are that make things possible or impossible in your life, right? If you don't give it 110%, then you will never really know. Now, I think for most of you, it's easy to see how this applies to sports. Like if you don't train with 110% of ferocity, how shall I put it? If you don't absolutely give it all you have to give, then you'll never know what you're capable of in the sport. You'll never know what's possible and impossible for you in the sport. Maybe it's harder to see how that applies to being an author, being a writer, the life of the mind. That's why we're having this discussion right now. But no, I don't believe in balance. And as I'm indicating here also, I don't think it's likely that the constraint or the limitation you're going to run into is technique. Like I don't think it's likely that what's going to halt your progress is that you're doing the push-ups slightly wrong, slightly less than optimally. If you're doing 200 push-ups a day, you're doing 200 push-ups a day. If you're only doing 20 push-ups, but you're doing it with perfect technique, right? This is not going to make the difference. You're not. So Melissa, do you want to jump in? I mean, for you, you've lived such a different life than I have. So,
Yeah.
No, but look, there was a time, I'm not going to mention anything that's secret. But, there was a time when you took on a totally new career path, going into a specialized form of nursing. So this is nursing for people with disabilities in speech. It's a ton of work, a ton of study. And look, by all means, disagree with me wrong. When you quit, so you did all this research and all this work and you took courses and things to prepare for this new special career. And when you decided against it, you were 100% certain, no, this is not the career I want. This is not the career I want. Yeah. So I just said, it may seem like you have no experience with this book, but I think that is an example, But,
yeah, no, I there's a lot to think about, like you said, and to examine in my life in what ways I've half-assed things and what I've actually given it 100%, and then known, at a certain point, you have to count this as the end.
And it's a different kind of regret, right? Like I'm not saying there's no regret one or the other. Do I regret moving to Cambodia? Sure. But when I was in Cambodia, gave it 110%. I was learning the Cambodian language, history, politics. Sorry, I just say, but I have lots of those examples. My point is, even someone like Melissa, you can actually relate to that. I think even your engagement with music, classical music, playing instruments, I think it's a similar sort of thing where you gave it 110% until one day you figure out you got to give it 0. No.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's flattering. I'm very self-critical, so I can think of ways I could have really put more into my study of music when I did. I can think of ways that I should have been more dedicated to the study of speech pathology when I was interested in that and when I was researching that and pursuing that. So, I mean, from my perspective now at age 29, I'm very critical of how I spent my youth. So, I appreciate you saying that, but that was with that career decision. I went through a series of just deciding, I'm gonna do this 100% and then quit. I went through that multiple different times. So yeah. I just say it's
the agony.
It's not like you.
Yeah. Well, you say that. I think it's, of course, it's not the same. Nothing else is studying Pali. Nothing else is studying Cree. Nothing else is studying Ojibwe. Nothing else is studying Chinese. I get it. But still, and nothing else is being a creative writer. Nothing else is writing a novel, whatever you want to say. But still, I do think there's at least a point of comparison there where you know to some extent the agony, where we speak.
Yeah, for sure. I think something that in the question that I found interesting is that, there's no point in being a writer, a good writer, if you have nothing to write about. That's just something I think you would have a lot to say about because you've lived an interesting life, and you do have you have a lot to say, and you could write a lot. And I remember various people like suggesting that you write a memoir because of this, and every time you've basically said, well, I'm not interested in writing a memoir. So yeah, maybe you could. I'm just curious about that decision. Your decision has not been to write about your travels in just a self-indulgent way. Whenever you write about or talk about your life on YouTube, it's you have a point. You're not just.
Well, I relate this back actually to something you quoted from me. Melissa recently quoted one of my own statements on Twitter. So I now haven't used Twitter for several years, but what I said in the past on Twitter is still there. So this is useful for the topic of this video, but it's not related to the question sent in from a viewer. But I had a statement on Twitter to the effect that, no, writing is not about what you have to say to yourself. It's not a process of self-examination or self-reflection. Writing a story, writing an essay, writing a book, it is actually about communicating to other people. It's not writing a diary. It's not talking to your therapist. And I do think that's as simple as that misconception is. It's one of the most prevalent misconceptions. And, to give an example, the poet Rilke has a book, Letters to a Young Poet. It's his advice to an author getting started. You can imagine it's still this day, it's a best-selling book. It's telling people what they want to hear, especially from a kind of Judeo-Christian theological perspective. And it's all about, looking within. Man, you can't learn this from anyone else. You can't learn how to be a writer from other people's criticism or responding to what people want. No, man, it's just about looking within and your own feeling and your own sorrow and your own love. And this is a totally self-indulgent, solipsistic, and diaristic form, of writing. So, my whole approach to writing, fiction and nonfiction, I am writing for an audience. Like, I am writing for a client. I am writing to spec. That's very much my approach. And, again, you guys now can read my writing. You can criticize it. My writing does contain anecdotes about my relationship with my father. My writing does contain anecdotes about my relationship with my first wife. But you will see those reflections are really used to exemplify and explain the thesis, the political point I'm making. It does have an emotional effect on the reader, but is by no means self-indulgent, solipsistic, or diaristic. That is really being said, for you. So, there are many aspects of this. Look, could I have written a book at age 21? Before I had gone out to see the glory of Cambodia, or whatever you want to say, before I'd done these other interesting things in my life. This will connect to the advice I'm going to give to this person's writing in. I think the main stumbling block wasn't the main thing that would have made it impossible for me to be a good writer at age 21, but made it easy at 31 and even easier at 41. Actually doesn't have to do with experience. It doesn't have to do with being an interesting person, which is a complex concept and only partly may be derived from experience. Because again, plenty of guys have been to Cambodia. Plenty of people have spent time in Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Most of them are not interesting people. There are people who've been to all the same places I've been, and they have nothing interesting to say and no interesting stories to tell about it. I really think the main stumbling block was just that I had never given voice to. I had never verbally spoken through the things I would need to write about. So already at age 21, right, I'm deeply unhappy with democracy in Canada. I'm deeply unhappy with the university as an institution, or with high school as an institution, with the police, with indeed, with Parliament, with City Hall, with ecology. I'm deeply unhappy at 21 with the genocide of our Indigenous people, with the fact that the Indigenous languages are going extinct and nobody seems to care. Nobody's going to do anything about it. There's a whole long list of things I still care about today, and I already cared about them at age 21. And be real with you, at 21, I already was an interesting person. I already had interesting things to say about that, right? At a minimum, I had something interesting to say negatively in terms of a demolition of other points of view, right? There's something I could contribute as a writer. Whether or not I had something so much to say positively is another question. Do you need more life experience of that, right? I think it's really very artificial to separate writing from speaking this way. This is a digression that's not a digression at all. Why are romance novels so terrible? Modern romance in modern novels. Not talking about 19th century or 18th century, 2000. Why are romance novels so terrible? They're written by people who have no real experience with love for an audience that has no real experience in love. It is absolutely a for-profit industry consisting of the blind leading the blind. I mean, it's this kind of mystification for the sense of mystification. And think about how differently any of these books would be written if it was really written by someone who had a lot of this kind of experience, being married, being divorced, having gone through those things, and then writing about that in a really realistic and useful and cautionary way. Well, when you go through those things, when you have there's having the experience, whether that's going to Cambodia or falling in love and getting married, and then later getting disenchanted and getting divorced, okay. But what goes along with that, if you're not a nebbish, if you're not a shut-in, right, is talking about it. And not talking about it once and not talking about it twice, talking about it 10 times, talking about it 20 times, talking about it 100 times, right? Like how many times, because I just say flashback. I had a friend when I was still in university who was an immigrant from Syria. So his parents immigrated from Syria when he was a toddler or a baby, I forget, but he was very small. He had basically grown up in Canada. He spoke English as his first language, but he Syrian immigrant family, could tell their whole story. They lived in a small town in Ontario, not in the big city. Okay. And I remember one of the first times I ever tried to verbalize what was so wrong with the university and the classes, that like, look, the whole system is broken and this is torment. And I want to drop out of these classes or I want to commit suicide. Like it's that bad being in this university. It's so terrible. I was trying to articulate it to this guy. This is really possibly the first time I tried to tell anyone. And his response as a Syrian immigrant who had never been to university himself was 100% hostile, 100% contemptuous and dismissive. He absolutely could not believe that the university was anything other than a wonderful privilege that rich people were enjoying and that he was not enjoying. Now, okay, we can say it in that way. We can fault him that he wasn't capable of, but the fault lies with me. I couldn't verbalize it. I couldn't explain it to him in a way that would get through to him what it was that was so terrible about these university classes. Now, sure, obviously he was hostile. He didn't want to listen. Some of it's on his end. But you think about what a challenge that is. So how is it challenging me? Now, I'm Jewish. He perceived me as Jewish too. He didn't perceive me as white. He perceived me as Jewish. In some contexts, these are two very different things. But here I am, a relatively privileged Jewish Canadian. He's a Syrian immigrant. And he feels like he's being excluded from going to university. I'm not going to tell his whole life story here. It's not really true. His parents are wealthier than mine. I do know his family story, but not worth saying. Actually, his parents were quite wealthy. They were wealthy but unsophisticated. He can't go to university, and he doesn't get along with his parents. He's got his own situation here. All he can do is feel envy and resentment towards me. And in downtown Toronto, he's literally walking past the university often enough. It's not far away. He's seeing these architectural monuments, right? And thinking this is this wonderful institution. He wishes he could be inside, right? What a challenge for me as a creative writer. If you think about it as a composition, can you write an essay? Can you write an epistle? Can you write a monologue as a stand-up comedian that's going to reach that audience? It's going to reach someone and say, hey, look, I know you think there's something wonderful happening in the university, but it's so bad, it's so awful. I want to drop out of these classes, or I want to commit suicide. Like, it's really that bad. Being enrolled this university, it's that terrible. Can you, like, this is a huge challenge, right? Now, sorry, again, just thinking through the first several times I had to verbalize that kind of critique to someone. Sometimes you're talking to a professor. Sometimes you're talking to your parents or your grandparents. But you're talking to people, and their idea of the university may be from the 1960s. Their idea of a university may be from the 1940s, right? They have a whole different, like, in as much as they know what a university is, they may not have thought about it for a really long time, right? And it's just all the different kinds of ignorance and arrogance and reluctance you're going to encounter in just trying to explain universities in Canada are awful. Now, I just wrote a book, and does anyone know how many pages of my new book, No More Manifestos, are specifically about specifically about the complaint that universities in Canada are awful? There are quite a few pages in there saying that, and you guys can read the book, and then you can tell me, how bad a job did I do? How did it work out? But anyway, I made the effort, and it was a challenge as a creative writer. But this is what I'm saying. So I am answering Melissa's question here, and it connects with answering the question from the viewer. I don't actually think that going to Cambodia made me an interesting person. Living and working in Laos made me an interesting person. However, I did verbalize to people in Cambodia, to people in Laos, to people in Yunnan, China. I did explain to them how fucked up Canadian society is. That's a really interesting challenge. Like, think about that as a challenge for a writer. I've mentioned this before. I'm probably going to mention it again in future. When I was in Laos, I met and spoke to people who literally thought that Australia and Europe were very close together because they had only ever seen a two-dimensional map of the world, and they thought the map of the world worked like Pac-Man, the arcade game Pac-Man, where if you go off one end of the map, you teleport to the other. They literally thought the reason why Australia was full of white people was that it was a really short trip from the south of Australia to like the north of England. You could just go whoop and reappear. That was how you could do boat travel. This is the level of ignorance of the world we're talking about. And, so to sit and talk with people, often in their language, in a foreign language, but even if it's in English, in a really foreign culture, and explain to them, look, I know you've heard some things about my country. Some of you have heard my country is hell on earth. You've heard it's this horrible imperialist, capitalist, terrible place. Not that often did you encounter people. But by the time I was there, most of the communist propaganda had kind of gone on this stuff. Okay, and maybe you've heard that it's paradise and the streets are paved with gold and everyone's wealthy. You know what? I'm going to try to communicate to you this really sophisticated, cynical view of the world. You know what? The problem is that the education system is hollow. We have universities, but they don't work. We have parliaments. We have ostensibly democratic institutions, but don't work. So I'm saying, if you think about it in terms of just the talking, just the verbalization, just the analysis, just the conversation, just convincing others of your point of view, right? In that sense, those journeys, that time, right, that made me a better writer, and it made me better at doing what we're doing right now in giving monologues. You don't have to go to Cambodia to do that, okay? I think the reason why so few people in the 21st century are capable of writing anything, fiction or nonfiction, is that they are drug addicts who stay at home playing video games. Like, period. If your life revolves around smoking marijuana and playing video games, you will never develop as a writer. It doesn't matter if you do that in Canada or in Cambodia. I mean, you can go to the North Pole and the South Pole. You can go to the Antarctic and back, and the whole time you're smoking marijuana and playing video games, you're never going to develop in this way, right? But, in case you haven't noticed, implicitly, I've also been breaking down the barrier between speech and writing. If you can say it in a monologue, you can write it in a book, right? If you can compose what you're trying to say, the story you're trying to tell, you can say it into an audio recorder and play it back to your own voice, right? If you can overcome that challenge, then you can be a great writer. Now, and if you can't, what the fuck are you going to write about? Just to put a human face on that, and make it easier to understand what I'm saying here. Hypothetically, let's say you have a cousin who got married, and then let's say just 1 year after he got married, he got divorced. And nobody told you why or whatever. And you start asking around different members of your family. You ask your grandmother, "Oh, hey, my cousin Ed, I heard he got married, but then seemed like just a few months later he got divorced. What happened?" You get your grandmother's perspective. Okay. And you talk to your older sister, right? You talk to this person or that person. You get a few different versions of events. And then finally, you talk to him. You talk to Ed. You get a whole long story from it. Oh. And now let's say, just by happenstance, a few months after that, you bump into Ed's ex-wife. And then you hear her side of the story. What if you take that constellation of different versions of events, right? Different versions of events, and you bring them together, and now you want to tell your story. You want to tell the story. Okay. Can you record that as a YouTube monologue? How many takes do you need? Okay, you need a minute to think about it, right? And your version may include the incongruous contrast between what one person said and what another person said, things that just don't make sense to you, right? What was it that happened? And you may have a strong sense of who your cousin was in high school. And you may now be questioning, how much did he change in the few years he was in university, or in the 1 year of his marriage? In what ways is he a different man from the man you thought he would turn out to be? You have some question. Oh, now you have a story to tell, right? My point is, it's not the craft of being a writer, right? It's not technique. It's not methodology. Can you tell that story, right? Can you organize all the different plots and subplots, right? The different things the audience you're going to conceal and reveal to the audience as it goes. Can you make that into a story that's in some way, perhaps it's slightly philosophical, perhaps it's meaningful, perhaps it's instructive, perhaps it's comedy, right? Perhaps it's really just funny. You tell it in the funniest way possible, whatever the story is you have to tell. People will never develop the ability to do that, smoking marijuana and playing video games. And this is an epidemic in our society. Now, my grandparents' generation, they were not angels. They were terrible people in many, many ways. My grandparents' generation generally, and my grandparents as particular people, terrible people in many ways. However, they spent their time sitting around playing cards and talking with the other people. Like, just the number of hours those people spent talking, right? On their way to work, on their way from work, while sitting around playing cards. Talk was a huge part of their lives. Telling stories was a huge part of their lives. So what have I been doing on this YouTube channel for the past 5 years? Maybe for the past 8 years by now, right? I mean, I'm giving you real with you. I already think I was a great writer at 25. I didn't have a way to make money out of it, so I didn't do a whole hell of a lot of writing. I think already by 25, I had everything I needed in terms of technique or skill to be a great writer. By 35, I had more than enough, right? But it's kind of interesting what happened in my life between age 35 and age 40. Right? I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours talking and storytelling, right? And you can too. All right. So point one, the first part of my reply to this letter was, I don't believe in balance, right? I don't recommend balance for anything. This guy, don't search for a balance in your intellectual interests, right? If you're actually interested in something, why aren't you committed to it 110%? And maybe you're not that interested in it. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe if you try to commit to it 110%, you can't. Maybe that tells you something about yourself. Maybe that tells you something about the thing you're interested in. There are languages I studied for a short period of time. I studied Korean at 2 different points, at least, maybe 3 points. At 2 different points that I recall now, I studied the Korean language. I started learning Korean, right? Why? I had good reasons. I could tell you all the reasons I want to learn Korean, but they were incorrect, right? I wanted Korea to be something like Cambodia. I wanted Korea to be a war-torn country, with democracy contending against communism, right? It's not completely crazy. In case you didn't know, North Korea and South Korea are still in a state of war. It's not completely off base, right? But what I figured out was, in effect, Korea could never be for me what Cambodia and Laos would be. This is way back. I studied Korean before I committed to studying Cambodian, before I started getting involved in Cambodia and Laos, right? So I'm just saying it wasn't crazy, but you try to do Korean, you commit to 100%, and then you start to figure out what it is you're getting into, and maybe it's wrong for you, right? And again, you may also figure out things about yourself. You may figure out why it is you person. So another example, I've never wanted to commit 110% to being a visual artist, to being a painter or a illustrator. But I have written children's storybooks, and I have many times wanted to be able to illustrate my own children's storybooks, right? And I have a certain level of skill as a kind of cartoonist. I can draw okay. All right. I have bought books in the past. I have bought pens. I've bought materials to sit down and start getting serious about improving my ability in illustration. It's a lot of hours. It's a lot of commitment. You really want to do this? You know what I'm saying? And I'm not looking for a balance, guys. I'm not looking for a hobby, right? Either I'm 100% in or I'm 100% out. Either I care passionately about illustration enough, I'm going to draw the best I possibly can. I'm going to improve my skill level in illustration and drawing. And I'm willing to publish this book with my name on it, with my pictures in it, right? That's your reputation on the line. If these drawings are not good or are not good enough, right? It's your Beatrix Potter moment, right? It's not a hobby. It's not a game, right? It's 100% commitment or it's nothing. And we're just talking about children's storybooks here, but that's the truth. In effect, you would ruin a good storybook with lousy illustrations, right? Nobody would ever take the quality of your writing seriously because of the low quality of illustrations if you're not in it absolutely 100%. So, there is no balance. I feel like balance in this sense is a biological metaphor, and people don't stop to think how misplaced the comparison to biology really is in these situations. Okay, how much protein do you need in your diet as opposed to how much fat, how many grams of carbohydrates, right? The classic macronutrient breakdown: fat, protein, carbohydrates. You can talk about this as a balance. This is what we talk about, biological factors. Guess what? What we're talking about here today has nothing to do with balance. Balance, it's just like toto genere inappropriate. This is a totally different category of things, right? It's an error in reasoning to think you can apply it to this category or genre of things entirely. All right. So I continue reading his question here. Quote, for context, my main ambition in life has always been to become a writer, fiction and nonfiction. Why? All right. Now, if I were talking to this guy face to face, I don't know his age. He could be 19. He could be 49. I don't know. Doesn't matter. If I'm talking to him man to man, this is where it's going to get real uncomfortable and real intimidating, right? Why? Why is it the fantasy of being a writer that has always appealed to you, of working in silence and isolation and then publishing and being adored and celebrated by millions? Doesn't that tell me something kind of ugly about you? You don't want to be a stand-up comedian, huh? You don't want to have to write jokes for an audience and then get on stage and find out what's funny and what's not the hard way, huh? You don't want to be a radio talk show host, right? You don't want to be a YouTuber. You don't want to do research and political commentary on YouTube. You don't want to be a politician. You don't want to help people. You don't want to be a policeman. Why? Why, right? And if you wanted to be a writer, right, why wouldn't you want to be a filmmaker? Why? You say fiction and nonfiction. Oh, so you're too good to do documentary filmmaking? Why? So what? And just saying, because his statement is that he always wanted to be a writer. Always. You never wanted to be a fireman. You never wanted to be a police officer. You never wanted to be a stand-up. Really? Like when you really think about it, maybe what you really wanted was to be a stand-up comedian. But you figured out that you're too shy or you're too awkward or you're not handsome enough, you're not charismatic enough, and you retreated to this fantasy of being a writer. Maybe. But for someone else, maybe it always was the fantasy of being a writer, right? One of the crucial aspects of being a writer is that it is a lonely life. You work alone and nobody understands you. And then the fantasy is that, like George R.R. Martin, you end up fabulously wealthy and surrounded by fans and women adore you even though you're fat and ugly and old, right? That's the fantasy. What percentage of people get to live that fantasy? And look, guys, I'm living my dream. I mean, probably 1,000 people are going to read the book I just published. Man, trust me, I'm elated. Right? Like, and that book, okay, let me ask you, this is the year 2022. If you were going to make a top 10 list, the 10 most important books about veganism published this year, year 2022, I'm a little bit biased. Where do you think I am? No, some other genres, it's hard. Are you going to be in the top 10 for the fantasy and science fiction books? That's hard, bro. Okay, let me tell you, I know I'm in the top 10. I didn't say most popular books about veganism. The most important books published about veganism this year, the most important books published this decade. Okay. I know I'm going to be in the top 10. I know I am in the top 10. Who's my competition at this point? Gary Francione, retired. Gary Yourofsky, an idiot and retired. Earthling Ed. Who's out there to compete with me for book of the year or book of the decade? Who else is in that top 10 list, right? Now, again, I know my writing, it's profoundly unpopular. It's unpopular for profound reasons. It's unpopular not because it's poorly written, because it really has a jarring, disturbing message people don't want to hear. Right? I am not lamenting that I've sold fewer copies of my book than How Not to Die by Dr. Greger, followed up by its sequel, How Not to Diet. Oh, shout out to The Skinny Bitch Diet. Oh, how many more copies could I have sold if I'd written this kind of book, right? No, my dude. If I sell 1,000 copies, I'm elated, I'm delighted, I'm over the moon. And guys, if I sell 200 copies, I still know I wrote this book that was tremendously important within this niche genre, right? Like, that's where I'm at. I'm happy about it. Okay. But this gets at something else that's interesting here, which is that I don't think of myself as a writer. I don't think of myself as an author, and I would never say this for myself. Sorry, I don't want to show this guy's name on screen. I would not say this for myself. I wouldn't say, oh, I've always thought of myself as a writer, like as my career or as my identity or something like that. Right. And look, I mean, again, I say, if I were talking to someone in person, this is where it can get a bit confrontational. This is where it can get a bit intimidating, where you're really asking why. Now, Melissa had an interview recently. You had a phone interview where they were asking, I'm just going to be vague about what the job was, but they were asking, why do you want to do this job? I just found it really funny, they basically said to you, tell me why you want to do this job, and don't say it's for the money. You have to have some loftier purpose or ambition for why you want this job. I was in the room. Well, why do you want to be a writer, or why do you think you want to be a writer? Obviously it's not for the money. You're not going to tell me it's money. Why? Why? And maybe the answer is something wholesome and good, but maybe it's a little bit dark. Maybe the reality is that you want to be adored and famous, and you don't want to do any of the things that famous people do to earn that adoration and acclaim. You know what I mean? You don't want to have to get out. You don't want to have to get on stage and face the cheering and also the booing of the crowd. You don't want to have to work for it in that way. You don't want to have to go through all the things that musicians go through, so on and so forth. Maybe there is a specific reason why being a writer, really appeals to you. Now, in the 21st century, published media, books on paper, magazine articles, anything like this, they are no longer a leading indicator. They're a lagging indicator. So I just said, hey, probably 1,000 people are going to read my book. It's $1, by the way. This is another reason why I can be assured it's going to reach a pretty large audience. Very cheap book. You can get it from Amazon for 99 cents in Europe and so on. Maybe $1.30 in Canada. It's a little bit different place. Okay, obviously you're not doing this for the money. Those people, if it's 1,000 people, they're reading that book because they already know me, because they already trust me, or because they have some kind of curiosity about what I'm going to say based on YouTube, based on this medium right here, right? A greater and greater percentage of books are published in that way today, right? It's published because the interest in the book has already been created by something on social media or otherwise outside of the book, something that's happened in real life, something that's happened in broadcast media, some other creative art form. And that's very much the opposite of the way the world used to work. It used to be that you published a book first and then it got made into a movie. Now, in a lot of ways, you got to get out and make the movie first so that people read the book. So he says fiction or nonfiction. So any of you in the audience, this is great advice. Do you want to write a book, let's just say about ecology? Let's say specifically about an ecological disaster. There's a specific river or a specific valley, a specific forest, and it's ruined, it's wrecked. Okay. The only way you're going to sell that book is by making a documentary movie first, and then publish the book and say on the cover, here's the book, with the same title as or tied into the hit documentary movie. And I'll be honest, even if the movie is a flop, your ability to get a mainstream publisher to publish and distribute this book and give it a chance, give it a shot at reaching a larger audience, it's completely going to hang on the documentary movie. So most of my audience are vegan, Cowspiracy, any of those. If you published Cowspiracy, the book, to come out accompanying the documentary movie, you have a hit documentary movie, then it's going to sell. But if you just have a book by some guy about some ecological disaster, how many copies are you going to sell? Right? Today, in the 21st century, the answer is practically zero. This is what I say. I'm slightly misusing the terms leading indicator and lagging indicator in their economic sense. But I'm saying, the leading medium is now no longer writing. So what sense does it make to want to be a writer if you're basically talking about a derivative art form, right? What is it? There's this overused joke that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. If you haven't heard it, I've heard that 100 times. Oh well, what's the point writing an article about music? Writing about music is like dancing about architecture. It's kind of very arch, ridiculous sense. Okay, well, look, the reality is in the 21st century, right? You can write a book about dance, any kind of dance imaginable. How has dance changed in Cuba over the last 20 years with the collapse of communism? Okay, you can write a book about dance. You can write a book about architecture, any of these things. But today, right, you're going to have to make at least a hit YouTube video, if not a documentary movie about dance. You're going to have to get out and dance. You know what I mean? You could do a reality TV show. You're going to have to get out and do the thing itself, right? In order to have a book that sells that's attached to it, right? I would say that for the most mainstream of interests, let alone when we get into the more esoteric and more political interests, because I'm someone writing for a minority within a minority within a minority, right? So look, real talk. What if I wanted to publish a book about Buddhism, right? I got 10 years in the game, but it's not enough. I've got to go and make a documentary film. I could make a documentary film that completely consists of interviewing former Buddhist monks who lost their faith, reflecting on their past. I'm going to be real with you. Doesn't have to be a hit. Like whether it's on Netflix or it's on Hulu or something, but we have a documentary film and it's called Buddhism, Lost Faith. Buddhism, all is impermanent, even Buddhism. That's the title. Okay. And it's just talking to these guys and translating and bringing together their experience and examining what are the effects of Buddhism on these people's lives. Okay, now you've got a book deal. Now you've got a book that can sell. And I'm not saying that's a hit movie, right? That's not going to be like the next Bruce Willis movie or something, right? But the fact that you produce it, the fact that you can show it, again, I'm not just writing about dance. I'm actually getting out there and dancing. And you can see it on YouTube. You can see it on film, right? And now I've got a book. That's the era we're living in, And just saying, look, some of you in the audience are just sitting there with your arms crossed, like, yeah, we know already. For some of you, it's not surprising. The sense in which it's surprising is if you have grown up with this idea of being a writer as something separable from just being. No. You get out and you actually do Buddhism. And then you lose your faith in Buddhism, and then you make a film interviewing other people who lost their faith in Buddhism. Okay, now you've got something, and now you can write it up, right? And I apply this to everything. Sorry, whether it's dance or architecture or anything else. You got to go out and do architecture. You do a great film just talking about what a ripoff, going to college to study architecture is. You can interview disillusioned architecture students, people who dropped out and people who used to be architects and quit to do some other job, talking about a lousy line of work architecture is, how people think it's a great line of work and it's terrible. Sorry, it's just parallel to the example on Buddhism. Okay, and now you've got a basis for a book that will sell. But you see, being and doing and knowing in this sense now are not separable from writing. This idea of being a writer. And that's why, to me, it's just slightly strange. It's not totally bizarre, but slightly strange to then have the sentence in the message, quote, I also know there's no use being a writer if you have nothing to write about. Right? Now, again, I already established earlier in this monologue, writing is not diaristic. Writing is not about self-expression. Writing is not about reflection. It's not about introspection. Writing is about communicating something to a reader. Writing is about communicating to the audience, period. There's nothing else going on there. Like if I make that film, it's not about what Buddhism means for me. It's about what Buddhism means for you. And I'm going to stuff it down your fucking throat. I'm going to tell you what Buddhism ought to mean to you. And if you started watching this film with a different set of beliefs about Buddhism, I want to totally break you down and shake you up. So by the end of watching this movie, Buddhism doesn't mean to you now what it meant to you before, right? If any of you have read my books, you will know the feeling I'm talking about. I got a compliment from J.J. McCullough the other day. I think I can out him on this. It was interesting the way he phrased this. It's not the way I think about writing. He said that when he reads my book, when he reads my finished writing, he says right away, he feels this sense of confidence that I get across in my writing. He says the same confidence he feels in listening to my monologues. Interesting compliment. I can take a compliment. Is it confidence? Obviously, it's just a compliment. He just meant it to flatter me or to thank me for the book once he started reading it. I get it. But I think in the context of what I've said to you, it's not really confidence we're talking about at all, right? If you've actually gone out and seen these things and done these things and been these things yourself, like I have been Buddhist and now I'm an ex-Buddhist. I've been there, I've seen that, I've done that, right? It's not about confidence anymore. And again, this is what I want to say. I think the contrast is between what he perceives as my confidence and the lack of self-confidence someone has when they're instead engaged in diaristic writing, self-analysis, self-examination, self-indulgence, this kind of thing, this pouring your heart out, this, where you're talking about your own feelings for yourself, as opposed to saying, look, whoever you are in the audience, I have something to say to you, and this is why it's so important. I think that's what he's reading as confidence, is that fundamentally my mode of writing is transitive rather than reflexive. It's not self-referential and self-examining. It's It's examining you, and it's communicating something to you, and it is trying to change your mind. It's trying to change you as a reader. In that sense, it would not be too much to say that all of my books are an attempt at a transformative experience for the reader. I'll just say, sorry, my father was a fool. He was wrong about practically everything. But it's interesting to note he had a very similar idea. When he made museums and he wrote the text that was going to go into the museum, when he was designing and creating a museum, his objective was to transform the attitude of the visitor, the attitude of the reader. He said he wasn't trying to burden them with information, with facts, with data. It was that they show up and see the museum, and then they fundamentally leave with a different attitude, with a changed attitude. It's an interesting conceit. I think my father was a terrible writer. I find his books really hard to read, or put it this way: I find it impossible to force myself to read his books. I find them so badly written. But I think he was onto something with that idea of what the relationship is between author and audience, and maybe that's what's being perceived or misperceived as confidence. Okay, quote: "I don't want to be someone who works for years honing my craft only to write shallow and empty books." So that to me is the ultimate riddle of hashtag booktube, hashtag authortube, hashtag writertube. What you see again and again is this fetishization of craft, fetishization of technique, commodification of method, and then, trying to propound one particular set of tips, one particular technique, one method as being the secret key that's going to unlock success for you. Very similar to diet and weight loss gurus and this kind of thing. I saw one video that was claiming revisions are bad. Never revise your writing. This guy was being, no, you do an outline, you write the whole book, no revisions. If you make revisions, it'll only make the book worse. That's his technique. And someone else is probably making a video saying, oh, you have to do at least 10 revisions and get 10 different people to read your book and give you feedback and do revision. Here's the secret to success: one method, one technique, or top 10 methods, top 10 techniques. But my perspective, I'm being real with you. My perspective is craft is nothing. Technique is nothing. For me, it comes back to that allegory of the boxer I had right at the beginning of the video, which is, either you have what it takes to compete or you don't. Either you have what it takes to get in the ring and punch someone in the face and get punched in the face. Either you've got it or you don't. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's easy for you to say. Some of you may be thinking, well, that's easy for you to say because you're a good writer, or you may be thinking it's because I always have been a good writer. No, I have always appreciated reading books, reading primary sources written by total outsiders, people with very limited literacy in English, frankly. I just give you an example. I read a book written by a military commander in Cambodia who fought in several successive wars. His English was very poor. I read several books written by Cambodian refugees. I've also read just sort of straight interview transcripts with different kinds of Cambodian, Thai, and Laotian survivors of different kinds of disasters, frankly. Even primary sources from history of Europe, some of the research I did on Russia, the quality of English is very poor, the quality of composition is very poor. I've read accounts, again, whether it's from kind of soldiers or refugees. I've read a lot of war material. This is not the only example. Back when I was married to an anthropologist, I read a lot of anthropology. A lot of that's in broken English and so on. You can be, one book I read that's very memorable to me is the account of a tribal person in Myanmar. He really grew up in a remote tribal group where they still practiced animism and had ancient beliefs and, different types of, frankly, ritual self-mutilation and what have you. Not great stylistically, not great in terms of craft. So it's fine. Like, I get it. Someone might see this and say, oh, well, you're saying craft is nothing, but that's just because you're like gifted at writing, or that I'm skilled because I have so many years of practice. I do have many, many years of practice as a writer. And, okay, maybe there's some, I see your critique to some extent, but my response to that is to say, no, I think actually I regard craft as nothing, partly because I have read things written from a Cree and Ojibwe perspective, from a Burmese perspective, from a Cambodian perspective, and just from like a soldier in World War II's perspective, from people who really had no craft at all. And I got to tell you, when you get in the ring, either you have what it takes to knock them out or you don't. You know what I mean? You have a story to tell. And guys, there's this really kind of prurient demimonde of true crime writing. There's this whole demimonde of actually autobiographies of prostitutes. And now, thanks to YouTube, you can just watch direct videotape of prostitutes talking about their lives. Very often, now I'm not generalizing, hashtag not all prostitutes. Some of those women have formal literary education. Some of them write in a very inflected and style, I'm sure. But many of them, obviously, their ability as a writer or their ability as a raconteur, they are speaking in very blunt and artless ways. But still, so I'm saying actually what I see as having real literary quality, what I see as being good writing, doesn't rely on craft. Look, so guys, even right now, the research I'm doing right now for the book, I could hold this up. It's a book. It looks like any other. The research I'm doing for my own book, I'm reading a lot of material from the American Revolution and the guys who directly participated in that, including soldiers, including people who committed atrocities with their bare hands. Really, not just in war, but torturing people and so on and so forth. And again, you can imagine a lot of that, the quality of writing is very poor, but it's still tremendously moving or tremendously important. So again, this isn't as simple as saying English is a first language versus English is a second language. So on and so forth. So I have a comment from the audience here. Go Figure says, quote, "Your critique of technique would apply to the entire self-help industry." Oh, yes. Mm. So he says, their channels are riddled with one method after another that doesn't work out for them. Maybe the most extreme would be speed reading. I don't know if you're aware of that scam of teaching people speed reading. That's probably the single most extreme example of this. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's an interesting question of whether self-help is the purest or the most impure of the forms of creative writing. But I'll say this with a certain degree of skepticism, it's possible you really could be, you could learn to become a better writer by reading really awful self-help books. And I think if you reflect on what I've said in the last 1 hour, you'd see why I'm saying that. Because self-help, it's very much written, often paragraph by paragraph, page by page, chapter by chapter. It's written to have a direct effect on the writer. A direct effect on the reader. It's written so that every page and every paragraph is going to transform your attitude. So that maybe you just read that chapter and you put the book down and say, wow, I used to see things this way and now I see them this way. So I don't read self-help books at all. I don't. But you could even criticize me by saying I have this in common in my writing with self-help books, that I want this very impactful style where I'm reaching out to you, and every chapter, it's really going to change your way of thinking. You came into this chapter with one set of assumptions, you leave with another. You read this book, you sat down to read this book as one person, you stood up after you finished it and you're a different man. You completely changed by every book. That is what I'm going for. So yeah, the self-help industry, in some ways, it's the worst of all forms of nonfiction writing. But in some ways, right, I'm conceding the point that you might learn to be the best kind of writer by examining the ways in which that's awful. All right, so I'll finish. Maybe you have more to say about this, babe. Melissa sitting off camera. Quote, "So I'm trying to figure out how to juggle the advancement of my craft with the dispelling of my ignorance. And within that, there are many individual research projects I could take up. How do you approach having broad interests? When do you just read a few articles? When do you read a few books? And when do you devote years of your life to something, as you did with Buddhism?" Woo! So Melissa here is 29. Yeah. Tell me, Melissa, for how many years have you been studying Chinese? Yeah, devoting years of your life to something, it can creep up on you. Did you, when you first got interested in Chinese, were you thinking this would be a 5-year, 10-year commitment. Was that how you felt? Did you sit down and think, this looks like it's going to take about 10 years? At what point did you realize?
Yeah, I don't know if I had an impression of how long it would take based off of, you advance so rapidly in Chinese just in a period of 7 months or something when you're living in China. No, I mean, look, I moved to China in 2017, and it wasn't really until 2018 that I started taking it seriously. And yeah, no, it's really this past year that I've been going as hard as I have with Chinese. And I think the more I think about it, you're probably right in terms of this idea of balance and broad interests.
Right.
Because I do have broad interests. I am interested in a lot of different historical, political, philosophical, economic topics, and how much have I actually read of any of these subjects? I would probably have been better off if I would have really just for 1 month devoted myself to reading, and finishing my focus on one subject, one book, rather than trying to, piece together all these different research interests. And so I try to remain open-minded about learning. And
I am just pointing out, when you first started talking to me, so when we got together, you were 24, right? You said openly that you had no idea what it was like to really commit to something like this for many years, right? I'm pointing out already now you do. Now you know what it's like, but I'm also pointing out there wasn't some simple fork in the road. You could say there were many forks in the road and many points of reconsideration or what have you. But depending on how you count it, we could say you are 5 years into Chinese. You know what I mean? Now, we can also say, just as another example, your reading of ancient Greek and Roman stuff. What have you got? You've got Plutarch. Yeah? You got Plutarch around? I bought her this beautiful copy of Plutarch that can be yours for, anyway, these are not those, but this is a famous series of editions, the Loeb editions of the classic. So, boy, she's still reading stuff from Greece. It has been at least 3 years, but probably 4 years that you've been reading. 4 years for reading stuff from ancient Greece. I'm just putting this in the context of that question. Now, you may not have thought this would be a 4-year project, and it may go on. It may be 10 years. You may read material from Greece and Rome for 10 years. That would not be if we now predict another 6 years, and at some point you've read it all or whatever, it's not part of your life that way anymore. It's possible. With Chinese, at what point will you know enough Chinese? Again, 10 years would be probably a conservative estimate. You probably could. We're just like, no. At some point, you're just completely fluent in Chinese. You don't have to work on it anymore. Possible. Could be 20 years, my point is to challenge this idea, how do you know when you're interested in something, you're committing to it from years? I don't know how old this guy is, And again, I try to present these videos where I think this is still meaningful if you're 49 or 59. I think, it is. But for most of us, already at age 29, Melissa is in a position to reflect on how these kinds of commitments, how it can become 5 years real quick,
Yeah, I just say, I sorry, I keep going back to your example of, you really were studying Buddhism for, intensely. Did you read, maybe this is too, did you read anything from ancient Greece or ancient Rome during that period?
Great question. No, nothing. No. So no, during that period of my life, it wasn't just Buddhism, but I was reading the ancient history. I was reading the modern history.
Right.
I was reading the colonial history in between ancient and modern. I was reading how all those things were connected. So, just use one example. So how France conquered Cambodia and Laos, how that relates to the more ancient, origins of Buddhism and history of those countries and what the culture was like before the French got there. And then the anti-colonial struggle and getting into the modern period and getting into communism. So that was a lot to read, So no, I was consumed with, and just to give an example, I mean, India was not my research focus, but still I read several books about politics of India, and still to this day, it always seems to me embarrassing that I know more about India than other white people. And it's like, well, guys, this wasn't even in my top 10 research interests, but I seem to know more about India than everyone else around me, including university professors. But like, you can imagine, so history and politics of India, different periods of time. So I'm just saying Buddhism for me was not just Buddhism. Another great example is just slavery. So I wanted to know the whole history of slavery, how it was connected to Buddhism in different periods of history, how it was connected to politics. I want to know the legal history of these countries. What was their legal system before Europeans arrived and started conquering them? What was their legal system after the Europeans left, et cetera? So again, political and historical. But yeah, Buddhism is a part of it. But I had a lot to read and a lot to study. And no, I mean that those things, along with studying the languages and along with having to get a job and pay my rent and buy my groceries, that was a whole life. It was an all-consuming research,
absolutely.
interest, and passion. Yeah.
Sorry,
No, it's good. But I mean, you're asking this, but no, for many years, anything like Aristotle and Plato, it really disappeared from my life. That's a good, thing to highlight. There were other things I was interested in and cared about that really disappeared from my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember what else in his message that we were responding to here. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, no, I don't know but that is a conglomeration of a lot of different subjects that you just, you weren't just studying the
Right.
ancient script,
Right.
ancient stone, inscriptions that whole time.
But I did also,
collection
I
of
did
a lot of
also study ancient stone inscriptions and
Yeah.
manuscripts and ancient sacred texts and religion and philosophy. I did all that also. Yes. Yeah. But the modern languages too. Yeah. Yeah. So look, I was just making the point. I mean, like I'm challenging the question. The question was, how do you know when something's just a minor interest or whether it's something you commit years of your life to, But I mean, I think you can see why that question wouldn't come up to me. It wouldn't come up for me. It wouldn't come up in that way. It wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be problematized in that way, right? I'm all commitment all the time, just keeping it real. I mean, either something is worth doing or it's not. I don't garden. I don't watch sports. I don't think about a balance between gardening and watching sports and the research I'm doing or the publishing I'm doing. So, And look, I said before, I've never really had a period of time when I thought of myself as a writer. Like thinking of yourself as a novelist, where that's your identity. But I think the truth is, my generation and the next generation coming up after me, we didn't have the luxury of thinking ourselves as writers. I never had the luxury of even surviving by publishing newspaper articles when I was in Cambodia, when I was in Laos, and so on. And specifically when I was in Cambodia, this is for different reasons, but partly because of freedom of speech. So when I was in Laos was a total communist dictatorship. Cambodia, there was some freedom of speech, some. And, when I was in Cambodia, many people said to me sometimes after talking to me for a short period of time, but sometimes after talking to me about politics for like an hour, they'd say, wow, well, look, you're amazing. You know all this stuff, just as I've described now, sort of history and politics and what have you. And I was very articulate in talking about it. So you should be publishing articles for, I don't know, whatever they said, the Times of London, or, they'd name some newspapers. And I'm like, no, it's actually impossible for me to earn money as a journalist. It's actually impossible for me to earn money as a writer. So, then you're into a period of time when the question is, what are you and who are you? Independent researcher. Well, what if you do research nobody wants to pay for? What if you're doing research that tells people things they don't want to hear? What if you're telling truths that are too terrible to tell, whether that's Buddhism styles. So, for me, I could never have my identity, my sense of self-worth or anything else, attached to the life of a writer or the identity of a writer. That was just not possible for me and my generation. Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, I could just say that in my experience of having chosen English as my major in
Yes, right.
university, I had people ask me, "Are you going to become a writer?" And I had to answer no for these
Right.
reasons. Essentially, because there's no way to earn money as a journalist. They didn't even have a degree in journalism at my university,
Right.
which is probably the only area that I would have been interested in as a writer. Is journalism, nonfiction is kind of the area of writing. So look, you have far more experience with writing than I do, and I just, it is a shame. It is a shame that you can't earn money these days as a writer. And I have to think about what the future is with you know, I just have to say, I think you're probably hitting the nail on the head. If you want your writing to be recognized, you have to do something else. Whether it's YouTube, making a documentary film, or dancing, being a performer, and making a reality TV show or something.
Right.
Like that seems to be how
You have to go out and do something real.
then people will want to read your book.
Right. And that creates the interest in your book. Yeah. And this has always been one of the fundamental paradoxes of the publishing world, was paying in advance, paying someone to write a book that doesn't exist yet, paying an author, paying a journalist to go to a country and do research and write articles that don't exist, and you don't know what you're going to get. But there was enough money in the game decades ago that sort of thing was possible or thinkable. And now, understandably, it's unthinkable. Who wants to pay for a book that doesn't even exist yet? And who wants to publish a book that doesn't already have an established audience, where you can't prove from the success of a YouTube channel or a documentary movie or something that this is a book people are going to buy or read? So end by reading a comment that's already been posted to Patreon. And I think I currently have this comment posted on Goodreads, appropriately enough. I said, "Publishing is dead. Self-publishing on Amazon is the present and the future. If you're a creative writer, and admittedly, I am, you can learn to cope with that reality, or you can spend the rest of your life bitterly resenting that you can't get paid the same way authors did in the 1960s. The internet changed the world, and now we have to figure out how to change the world using the internet."